we'd like to start by asking the four of you to each introduce yourselves and answer why it is important for VC firms to have policy positions. Brian, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Brian Quintenz. I'm the global head of policy at Andreessen Horowitz's crypto funds. Before this, I was a commissioner at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which probably none of you have ever heard of, but it's the derivatives regulator for the United States financial markets. And I'm pleased to have been a MBA at the McDonough School of Business in 2009. I think just quickly why it's important that we are here representing venture capital is that we're not really here representing venture capital. We're here representing entrepreneurs and innovators. As you think about the potential success of businesses like ours, they depend on the success of all of the founders that we have funded, but they depend on the next 10,000 innovators and entrepreneurs coming in, having the courage, having clarity to start their vision and dedicate their lives to their passion. And they need regulatory roadmaps to do that often. And the more that different governments put hurdles in their way to prevent them from doing that, that obviously is not good for growth. It's not good for U.S. leadership. It's not good for national security interests, and it's not good for business.
I'm Barrett Carr with Silver Lake. Thank you for allowing an animal of a slightly different stripe today because we are private equity, so we are later stage investors. My gig for Silver Lake is all about diligence, and it's about helping the portfolio companies in addition to anything that the firm needs. But in terms of why we need that, it's in terms of figuring out what the value is as you're looking at the diligence. The deal team calls and says, hey, we're thinking of investing in Waymo. Talk with us about autonomous vehicles, and where do you think that regulation will be in 3 to 4 years? So that's an important part of the diligent process. Similarly, in the portfolio, we have approximately 73 companies in the portfolio. And when a portfolio company runs into a government intersection that maybe they didn't expect, didn't anticipate, I can dive in and advise them on how they want to deal with that. We are not about, my position is not about impacting policy, but it's about assessing policy so that we can include that in the internal conversation.
Arun Gupta. I was a venture capitalist for 20 years at Columbia Capital. Started teaching at Georgetown here and at Stanford. Recently just released a book, Venture Meets Mission, which is out front, and we now have a foundation called Noble Reach Foundation. And we're really playing at this intersection of how do we get more talent and innovation into government. The reason I think it is incredibly important, the work that is being done right now with venture firms, educating and working with government is exactly what we talked about in the book. To solve these big problems, we need this kind of collaboration. And a lot of the gap that's there is very much an understanding, a cultural gap. And so I think the role that gets played in the framing is one for VCs to understand before they make deals or do the deal on the diligence front, what is the regulatory landscape look like and what are the opportunities there? So they're getting educated on the buyers or the regulators. But then once the deals are done and you're in it, it's educating the benefit of those technologies or emerging business models to solve these large problems and these mission-oriented problems. And that's how we're going to create a renewed partnership between entrepreneurs and government if we're going to solve these larger problems.
Hey, everybody. Jordan Coleman. I'm the Chief Legal and Policy Officer at Kodiak. My CEO was up earlier, so you know a little bit about what we do. Proud 04 MSB undergrad, Hoya Saxa. So super excited to be here. I think you heard one side of it. On the company side of the coin, there's a few things. So one, investors are extremely cognizant of risk, and regulatory can mean risk, especially in emerging industries. And I think, my friend mentioned it, which is, especially in a new space like autonomous vehicles, we are flying the plane while we're building it. And there is an evolving regulatory regime that's occurring as we speak. And the question is, where's that going to be in 2 or 3 years? And the only way to even have a thought is to really come here and do the contact sport that is DC. I think there's a couple pieces to that, right? One is evangelism, which was mentioned, right? We have to come here. We have to educate people. There's so many misnomers about what this technology is and where it's headed, how it's going to save lives and otherwise. And then the other piece of it is to try to influence regulation as well, be it through rulemaking processes, through DOT or otherwise. My CEO decided to complicate my life quite a bit after I finally learned trucking and transportation to get into defense business. Quite the alphabet soup and a whole new set of policymakers. If DC is a contact sport, that's it of its highest difficulty. And so it's just very important that that policy people, in conjunction with our investors, that we do that evangelism work, that we do that influencing of regulation policy, so that our companies can and our colleagues can focus on what they're great at. Go build great products. Go raise money. Go inspire people, and we'll do the important quiet work on policy.
Well, Jordan, that was a great transition into our next question for me. So how can public policy evolve to better balance technological innovation with necessary regulation, especially in emerging tech sectors such as AI, cryptocurrency, and autonomous driving? We'll start with you, Brian.
Sure. So, I mean, I think regulators are in a tough spot, especially when it comes to technology, the pace of innovation. There's no reputational upside to embracing innovation if you're a regulator, right? You get all of the downside if something goes wrong, and no one gives you credit if something goes right. So the incentive structures are very skewed. I think there are two things really that policymakers generally and regulators can really focus on when it comes to technology and innovation regulation. The first is a principles-based framework as opposed to a prescriptive-based framework. There's this really interesting aspect of the Titanic when it sank in 1914. The legal and regulatory response to that was, well, the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats for everybody on board, so we're going to require that passenger ships carry as many lifeboats per passenger. Well, that created an incentive that ship operators could increase capacity by adding more lifeboats, and you ended up with the SS Eastland disaster 1 year later in the Chicago River, which capsized because of the number of lifeboats that were on it relative to the increased capacity. So you have to have regulation that focuses on outcomes and not inputs. That puts the regulators in a good footing to embrace innovation, and it puts innovators in a good opportunity, in a good spot to test out different ideas. And the second thing I would say is that, especially when it comes to crypto, which is the side of the business that I'm at, you want to focus on regulating businesses, regulating applications, not regulating protocols, not regulating software.
Yeah, to build off of this, I like the conversation about the outcomes-based of the policy, and I also like the conversation about dialogue. The regulators, a lot of times, and they will admit this, don't know what they don't know. And so until you go in and talk with them with the real-world industry viewpoint, you can't get the best outcome. With autonomous vehicles, what we learned in the diligence, for instance, part of the reason that it's hard to figure out where regulations will go is that the regulators are currently working with an outdated framework that dictates, for instance, that every car has a steering wheel. Well, there's no reason to have a steering wheel going forward, but that's the basis of what they're working around. And so you have to go in and outline for them, here's why in the real world, this doesn't work. But I think it's just that dialogue that really keeps it moving in the right direction.
I agree with those comments. The one thing I would add is what gets lost in this conversation a lot is the talent. You need to have the tech talent and the people with the acumen that understand this on the regulating side. You need to be bringing them into government in some way, shape, or form. It's somewhat unfair to ask folks that aren't familiar with AI to go regulate AI, because then they're regulating something that they have no idea what the unintended consequences are. And so how we train and bring folks in, whether that be career or whether that be even in tour of duty kind of stints, where they can come in and provide their expertise, not only as inputs, but in helping solve and think about regulatory solutions for that, I think becomes really critical as well. And I think the talent piece gets lost a lot because it's easy just to say that's their problem, but it's an our problem, right? And how we collectively decide we want to solve that it's going to be important for us as a country, because as someone said earlier, we are flying the plane. Well, we're building the plane while we're flying it, and that takes a very different mindset than a typical regulator mindset would have.
Definitely want to double down on Arun's point about it's not enough for policy people to talk to the regulators. You do need to find the opportunities to bring in your technical experts. I mean, I will say, and I think I'm decent at this, but when I bring Don, when I bring our CEO in, it just brings a level of heft and a level of technical knowledge that I think can really open some eyes. And so I very much agree. I want to hit on a couple points that were already made, right? We need regulation to do two things for us, and they're somewhat diametrically opposed. We need frameworks that can evolve as the technology evolves, right? This is not fixed technology. It's not done, and it's going to continue to evolve, and we need regulatory frameworks that allow for that evolution. At the same point, we also need regulatory certainty. I do those diligence calls all the time, and they say, well, there's no rulemaking that's been promulgated yet. I said, yeah, but we have, interpretive guidance. Rightly so, I hear. Well, interpretive guidance is something that's really easy to change. A promulgated rule, not so much. And that said, government is it's a big boat, and it takes big boats a really long time to turn. And so, working through that process of getting, we've been working on trying to get explicit either legislation passed in the Self-Drive Act or rulemakings through FMCSA and NHTSA. I've been at Kodiak. I've been involved in Kodiak for over 6 years. I've spent 6 years working on it. It's still not there. The industry as a whole has spent 15 years working on it. It's still not there. And so, we need to encourage our government partners to work at the speed of relevance, while at the same time understanding that there is a lot of downside for them and not a lot of upside in terms of embracing this technology. That said, there was a time when people said, absolutely not, we can't have cars, only horse and buggies will work. There was a time that said, what are you talking about? You're going to take the elevator operator out of the elevator. That's unsafe. And I think that hits on a really important point, which is the competing priorities. The Teamsters are not the biggest fans of what we're trying to do on the commercial trucking side of the coin. And the Teamsters are an extremely powerful political influence within D.C. We have a Democratic administration. They're going to have a lot of influence. That said, Trump is going to meet with the Teamsters later this week. And I think we can all guess where most truck drivers vote. And so, we need to take jobs into account. We need to take all these competing priorities into account, bring everybody to the table, and try to drive to a solution that doesn't impede technology, but also doesn't lose the human element.
Thank you. On another note, what do you all believe are the implications of deep fake technology on public discourse and policy? How can companies combat fake news? Are implications like Twitter's community notes effective? Jordan, can we start with you?
I think it's more, I don't know if I can answer that question specifically, despite being a doom scroller on Twitter often when I'm on airplanes in particular. What I can say is it's important to be able to, it's not enough to talk to regulators, you have to talk to the public. Our technology in particular, it's only going to go so far as public acceptance, and it's only going to go so far as people understand that technology and see the benefits to them in the end. There was a study done by the Volpe Center, which is kind of the captive research arm at USDOT, that talked about the fact that autonomous vehicle technology will lead to literally hundreds of dollars in the pockets of every single American from the efficiencies that it's going to drive. People don't know that. All people know is they read about Cruise, they read about the mistakes that were made. I think that's another point, which is transparency is so critical. It's so critical with regulators, and it's so critical with the public at large, right? In a lot of ways, the Cruise situation, it was the cover-up was worse than the crime. The accident was really bad, but regulators said, hey, we feel like you're hiding the ball with us. You're hiding the ball with the public. That doesn't work. We don't trust you. And so you just have to make so many more deposits in the trust bank than you ever make with Charles.
Yeah, but when you get to deep fakes, I think there's only so much regulators can do, unfortunately. Right? I think it's how we handle it and then how you respond to it as an organization, a company, or an individual where it's happening to you. I mean, the two areas I spent time with Senator Warner where they're really focused on this and really concerned about it is obviously election integrity in our capital markets, right? And I mean, if you think of two pillars of our democracy that we really need to maintain trust, it is our election system and it's our capital markets. And, it's a very tricky and unfortunately, I don't think there's a silver bullet answer to it. But I would be tracking those two areas as probably best in class. And leaders and having to put in guardrails and what they can do. And some of it is the velocity of which you respond to some of these deepfakes and being able to verify it and things of that sort. But I think that's where the leading edge regulatory activity is taking place that I think we could learn from in other areas.
Similarly, I'm certainly not an expert on the deepfake space, but I do think we are, like, for instance, industries, we are looking at those spaces to see what those gold standards are. So, for instance, we have an internal working group at Silver Lake figuring out how we will allow our employees to use AI. What disclosures will we require? How will we let them use that? And we very much want to embrace it. But we are internally trying to figure out what those gold standards are. And I think when these are figured out, hopefully quickly, relatively quickly in these spaces, particularly like in the election implications, then we will key off of that. And those will be things that we will take internal. So it all sort of cascades down.
Well, I noticed that you had mentioned capital markets, the impact there. I mean, I think we can also talk about hacks and the impact there, and whether or not our regulatory agencies are taking the appropriate cybersecurity measures to protect their Twitter accounts or X accounts from sending out fake messages of approvals of new products, which they haven't. So there's a lot for everybody to do to, I think, shore up their own resiliency. I think on deep fakes, fake news, and I think you can even translate this discussion into intellectual property and patent uses and repurposing information, feeding into large language models. I mean, I think there's a really interesting solution that blockchain provides for that. I mean, you can post something that is on a immutable, publicly accessible ledger, right, that everyone can view, and that can automatically be discerned whether anything has ever been manipulated or changed, or whether that content has been transferred or used. I think that there's just some interesting applications there that we haven't yet seen the result of, or a lot of conversation around. But it's interesting that these technologies are coming to market now at the same time, and we think that there's a lot of overlap between them.
Now we're going to switch gears to monopolies. How does recent antitrust action impact your appetite for and confidence in M&A deals? What do you make of the Adobe Figma and JetBlue Spirit? And how will you take steps to protect yourself and your companies? What role should the government play in fostering competition and preventing monopolies in the tech industry? And I'll let whoever wants to start take this one.
I can start. Look, I think it really depends on where you are in the investment value chain, right? If you're an early stage VC, an early stage investor, you really don't care. It's the chances that your company is going to be at that level that they could be getting acquired by someone where this could be a problem is a good problem to be in, probably. So you've won if that's going to be the problem. Having said that, look, I think most people would agree. What everyone wants is consistency and visibility and predictability, right? And what's the hard part, having said that, is when the rules keep changing, right? And so knowing what the rules are, I think investors can then allocate capital and risks and things of that sort appropriately. But we were much more of an early stage fund, and so I think some of the monopolistic M&A activity didn't bother us. Now I'll tell you where it does bother you, and we're not there yet, is when people start putting retroactive look at saying, and let's take Facebook and Insta. Today it looks like that's very monopolistic. But at the time that acquisition was happening, having been someone in the space, there was no one that was saying that, right? And that's a dangerous thing to start going down. Because, again, I'm speaking as an early stage venture guy, you're really looking for those kind of acquisitions. 95% of deals or liquidity in our space is coming from M&A. It's not coming from IPOs and things of that sort. And so that's where I could see there being a little bit of danger and concern. But as far as the large deal, I think you've got folks here that are probably more equipped and are dealing in that space. We probably didn't see that so much.
Yeah, we watch the space quite closely, of course. I'm not going to comment on the specific companies that you raised, but I would say it's something we're quite mindful of. Does it dampen our interest in moving forward? No, but it does certainly provide a lot more caution, because you have to assume then that you may need to add in 6 months to this closing, and that's that's real time, and that's a real factor for consideration.
Is you have to run a business during those 6 months as well, right? The M&A process is already super painful, and the integration process is super painful, and you have operating covenants, but then also considerations from from antitrust considerations in there. What I'll tell you, I'm going to take my policy out and put my legal hat on really quick. What I'll tell you is be educated and be cognizant of the realities in which antitrust is going to play a part. From as little as, trust me, an investor, although they'll be annoyed that this is a reality, when you tell them, hey, you're about to jump above the HSR threshold that's going to require you to make a filing and pay a fee, they're not going to like that they have to pay the fee, but they're going to certainly be happy that you as counsel let them know that as opposed to tripping that. And it's certainly always better to do things cleanly and correctly on the front end than it is to do things on the back end. And so I would just be very cognizant of the realities. And we're talking about the U.S. here. I mean, we're not operating internationally yet, but my goodness, if you're going to operate in Europe, the U.S. antitrust is going to be the least of your concerns. European anti-competition or competition rules is something else. So be educated, be cognizant of these realities, inform your key constituencies, bring your board along, bring your CEO along, and bring in an expert when you need one. Best I can say.
Well, we'll move on. Many have switched their policies and viewpoints on crypto specifically. For example, take the recent arrival in spot ETFs or Larry Fink's newfound support of Bitcoin. Where and how should governments approach the regulation of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, and other financial technologies? Brian, considering your role, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm probably well situated for that. I mean, I think what I heard coming from traditional finance, TradFi, Wall Street institutions, in the discussion around, the crypto ETFs with the approval of a spot Bitcoin ETF and possibly moving to the approval of a spot Ether ETF, was that it was very client demand focused, right? They were hearing this from their clients. Their clients wanted access to these things, and given how different products came to market over the last 5-6 years, with the creation of Bitcoin futures, with the creation of ETH futures, with the creation of the Bitcoin futures-based ETF, and then the ETH futures ETF, and then a court case on the Bitcoin spot ETF, right? All of a sudden, the SEC kind of backed itself into a corner and didn't really have a lot of flexibility to keep denying these the approval of these products. So I think there was a market opportunity, there was legal leverage, and that ended up happening, and I think they'll continue to happen, with that path. I think where we think the conversation is much more relevant isn't really about, investors coming into crypto or people, putting their money into crypto. It's really the use cases of crypto that we think are the most appealing. I mean, we view, blockchains as a new kind of worldwide computer. I mean, if you think of like Bitcoin is the equivalent of having $1 in your pocket, Ethereum is the equivalent of having an iPhone in your pocket. It's a new application layer that anyone can build on, and the value can be distributed to the edges of the network, to the participants in that network, so they can own the content and the value of their participation. We think that's really the powerful thing, but right now we're explaining how the iPhone works as opposed to what it does, and I think hopefully soon we'll be explaining, more of what it does and what it brings.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Awesome. Let's move on. For those who have shifted from public policy to the private side, can you speak on that transition and any difficulties that emerged from it? How did you adapt your work life and execution style? Barrett, considering your past as Chief of Staff for Kevin McCarthy, let's start with you.
That's fair. So I did 20 years of work at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, so the White House, the Capitol, including a stint as Staff Director of Ed and Workforce. And it's quite different to go to the private sector. And when my colleagues on Capitol Hill ask about how they do that transition, and they want to know, in particular, like what the headhunter is looking for as they're hiring for these jobs downtown. And the answer is the headhunter wants to know that they can make that transition and that they can focus every day on the value add, because it's a very different mindset that you have to have. And if you lose that focus around the value add if I start walking around Silver Lake talking about the EITC tax credit, nobody's going to care, and they will wonder why they're paying my salary. But if I talk with them about, where AI policy is headed, and and then we take that across our platform and inform our portfolio companies of that, then we're talking about more value out there. But you have to keep that in mind every single day, because otherwise I'm a coster. I'm just costing the company money unless I figure out how to create that value.
I've not been on the public policy side, but to Barrett's comment, I think the other piece of it that makes the value add really helpful is being a translator, because you realize that venture and DC, they speak different languages. They may be saying the same thing, but they feel like sometimes they're talking past each other. So the role that someone like you play in an organization, having been in a venture shop, is incredibly important, because sometimes we don't know what we're hearing, or we're hearing something that we really aren't, and having someone help us really understand and translate that, but then also problem solve with us as to what's the right way to respond to it if we need to, becomes actually very valuable. But it's as simple as just having someone that can help you translate.
Yeah, when you see a bill has passed on Capitol Health, from some premier committee, people in my world may say, oh, well, then it's almost certainly going to become law, and it's very, very, very far. Yeah, like that. Or one of my portfolio companies is wrapped up in some regulation that one of the agencies is doing, and they, in terms of the comment period, they said, well, we have 25,000 agents who do this kind of work around the country, and so we'll have them all write a letter to CMS. CMS will hate us then, and we will not be having a constructive conversation. We could certainly have them all sign one petition and send it in, but it's channeling that energy and providing that strategy.
I guess I would just say I started off on the Hill, and then I went to business school, went into a hedge fund in the marketplace, went back into the government as a regulator, and then came into venture capital, but focused on policy in kind of the digital assets, crypto markets. So I don't have a lot of career advice other than don't have a 5-year plan, because there's just too much optionality out there to try to tie yourself down to a certain path. I think for me the interesting thing, when you take yourself out of the role of a decision maker and into the role of kind of a private market participant and an advocate, you're looking for the alignment of incentives, right? What do the people that I'm advocating to want? What are their motivations? And how can what I'm advocating for align with those things? And I think that there's it's interesting. I think the venture space technology and innovation has a lot to offer to everybody in the political spectrum. A lot of that's had a hard time breaking through for whatever reason, but it still makes me optimistic that because of kind of the breadth of conversations and the way that they can be focused towards people's motivations, it makes me optimistic that ultimately the U.S. will get to the right spot. So, to me, that's been an interesting dynamic.
Thank you. We're just we're just running out of time. I'm going to ask you guys one last question. As automation reshapes the workforce, what policies are needed to support workers in transitioning to the jobs of the future? How can technology support job transformation and not job loss? Jordan, can we start with you?
Love to answer that question. So obviously we spend a lot of time talking about jobs. I already referenced it earlier, right, with truck drivers. And I think the key to the conversation is A, to be realistic, B, to view it from a total lens. So firstly, it's very easy to be scared from an automation perspective that we're going to lose jobs. In the trucking world, for example, though, there's an 80,000 truck driver shortage, at least as of 2021. The average age of an over-the-road truck driver is in their 50s. Younger people do not want to do this job. They do not want to sleep on the side of the road for 20 nights out of a month. They don't want to be away from their family. They'd rather work a different job that pays similar or even less to be able to be home and get home for dinner, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, the realistic point I think is really, really critical, which is you'll hear a lot of upskilling and reskilling. We're going to teach truckers how to code. You might find a few truckers who you're going to teach how to code, but they're not going to become software engineers for the most part, right? So we need to start thinking about how do we transition them to kind of new economy, what I like to call light blue collar jobs, right? So maybe eventually, after we eat into this 80,000 truck driver shortage, which is going to take us a very long time, We like to say if you want to become a truck driver today, you'll retire a truck driver if you want. But think about autonomous truck technicians, autonomous truck inspectors, people who are doing some of the human necessary tasks in and around autonomous trucks, but in any sort of automation. And I think it's really thinking about that new job, not about trying to apply it into these unrealistic expectations of, again, we're going to turn truckers into software engineers. So I think that's really, really critical. And again, that's taking that broad lens. It's how are we going to impact other jobs? How are we going to drive efficiencies? I mentioned the Volpe study. How are we going to think about the economic impact on the communities in which we operate? Maybe, for example, and this is, we like to talk about doing the long, lonely 1,000 miles, right? But there's going to be a person who's going to drive to that depot, pick up a load, bring it to a highway adjacent location, and swap it onto an autonomous truck. We're actually going to increase the number of local and short haul jobs. Those are the jobs that people want. So again, the key is to take that holistic view.
What I would add to that is, as you think about upskilling and training, it's putting incentives in place for organizations to want to do this. We have tax incentives in place today for capital equipment when we invest. We don't do that for human investment. This is something that Senator Warner has been pushing and trying to get passed around training and things of that sort, how you depreciate. I think there's other incentives that we could be giving organizations to give them an incentive to be looking to upskill their workforce in a way, recognizing that this change is happening. I think on top of that, a lot of what we're seeing on the federal government side as well is how you think about the requirements of inputs that you need for workers. Does everyone need to have a master's degree? Do they need to have 10 years of experience? Because if you think about it, we have a very input-driven way of looking at the workers that we need to solve our problems on the federal side, whereas on the private side, it's very outcome-focused. You don't really care what someone's education is as long as they can get their job done. That's an entrepreneurial mindset, right? If you get this done, it doesn't matter. And I think there's things like that that could really open up a pool of jobs and opportunities for workers that don't have the accessibility to them today.
Yeah, and it's not often that I give the government kudos for for work in this space, but I will say in the job training space, particularly in the cyberspace, I think they've done a good job. There are programs that we are now seeing live, lots more cyber tech individuals, and we see this on the front lines with our portfolio companies. They are desperately looking for this job set, and I will say I think we're catching up on that front because the Fed's made a focus of it.
Yeah, I guess just from a big picture, we've had automation in industries for the last 60, 70 years, and I don't know a lot of people, maybe some, that would raise their hand and say, I want to just go back to exactly the way it was before. Different people have different mindsets, and that's okay, and there's certainly nostalgia, but there are really only two ways to kind of achieve growth. One is through increased population, and the other is through increased technology, and they can go hand in hand. And if there are good worker training programs, if there are very high quality school systems that can adapt quickly, and again, this is a process that's been happening for a long time, so you don't really need to adapt immediately, but that adaptation will come. We're an adaptable species, and we need technology in order to continue to grow.
One last thing I'd add as well is don't wait for the government to solve your problem as private industry, right? We know that we need autonomous truck technicians. We have our operations run out of Dallas. We work at Dallas Community College. We created a curriculum that said, hey, you're a technician, you know how to work on trucks. Let us teach you about autonomous trucks. We're going to breed our own workforce that we need. And again, I think you wait for the government, you might end up waiting quite a long time or be disappointed. So throw your hat in the ring, get involved, help this process of creating those next generation jobs.
So much. Let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists.